Welcome to Keeping the World Company on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today we'll talk about the brown shirts. It sure looks like the brown shirts have come to town. What and why does this remind us of the 1930s? Our guests for the show are Ben Davis of the University of Toledo Law School and Gene Rosenfeld, independent scholar. And our co-host is Tim Apicella. Welcome to the show, everyone. Trump's moves here in LA are a step beyond what he has done before. And they suggest he is moving the United States to a police state, just perhaps as Germany moved to a police state in the 1930s. The comparison is irresistible. Let's start with you, Gene. To what extent does this remind you of what was going on in Germany in the 1930s?
Hitler transformed the government after he was given the chancellorship by the previous administration. He did not win a majority in an election, but he came up through normal channels. And in 1933, assumed the chancellorship of Germany. And he had had some previous interactions with the state of Bavaria, the second largest state in Germany. And Germany, like the United States today, had state governors, had minister chancellors, and minister presidents, and they were like governors. And he had some interaction with Bavaria, wanting basically to nationalize it, not to keep the Weimar Constitution operating. And so we have parallels today in that Trump's approach to California is not dissimilar from Hitler's approach to Bavaria. And after there was a crisis, a national crisis with the torching of the Reichstag, which was their Congress or their parliament, Hitler passed a law and took over in an authoritarian way control of the states, the provinces there. And so he went to Bavaria and he ousted the minister president, put in his own man, brought in his own army, and basically took over Bavaria. And we're seeing a parallel. When you see these historical parallels, they're disturbing, Jay, because when you see something that is so similar to what has gone on before, you then look at the next steps. And of course, the next steps were that the Weimar Constitution was trashed, the Weimar Republic was history, and Hitler installed his authoritarian government.
That wasn't the end of it. You know, these dynamics are dynamic. They're not static. So he takes over this and that and the other thing. He uses the brown shirts, but that didn't last that long. And I think it was in 1934 where he organized the Night of Long Knives. And a fellow named, I think, Eric Rome was running the Long Knives, very dedicated to Hitler. He was history. He was killed. And there were a lot of brown shirts that were killed. And there was a new army, the SS, as I recall. And the SS took over. So what I'm saying is there was a dynamic. It never stays the same. It always moves on. It has to move on. For the dictator, the totalitarian, to stay in power, he has to keep on going. And that's what Hitler did, from the brown shirts to the SS. Your thoughts about what that teaches us today?
Yes. In the Night of the Long Knives, he had a 100,000-man army, but it was headed by Erich Röhm, who was a little bit like Prigozhin was to Putin. He was disagreeing with Hitler because he was a socialist. So Hitler organized a purge, but he utilized not just the SS, he utilized the army. And what he was doing as chancellor was making a bid for the German army. A lot of the political parties at that time had their own private armies. And the SS really grew out of Himmler's control of the state forces, armed forces in Prussia. Prussia was, of course, a very proud state with a military background. And so what Hitler did was absorb Erich Röhm's SA, which were the brown shirts, into the German army, having made an agreement with the army, the regular army, to back him. So in that was the way he assumed control of the German army. He didn't have that before. He had only his brown shirts, the SA. And then, of course, the SS grew in power as Himmler grew in power, part of Hitler's dual state, where his security, his real security forces carried out his whims. And then the civil state just sort of went on its own way and looked like it was in control.
So if we assume that Trump knew or knows Hitler's playbook, either from reading Mein Kampf in prison, for example, or being aware of it at some cortical level. And we also accept the notion that the dictator has to move on. He can't be static. He can't just stay the way it is on a given day. That tomorrow has to be more shock and awe, and he has to increase his power. What does this teach us? What can we learn? It seems to me that the military is very important in the way Trump sees the future, sees his expansion of power. And he has to take greater control of the military. He also has a fair amount of control now, but he has to take greater control. And when he does that, they become his military, loyal only to him, not to the country. I mean, what do you expect he will think of based on what he understands about what happened in Germany?
I'm sure there are a number of people around him who've been associated with National Socialism locally, who have made him aware of what's going on in Germany, even if he hasn't to that conclusion himself. But yes, there are some ominous signs. For example, this military parade he's having on his birthday that's coming up. The fact that he is renaming the bases in the southern part of the United States and changing that, um, in clever ways. The way in which he loves to appear in military sites and give lectures to military people, and he's not attacking the rank and file military. The upper echelons have been purged already of some of the major officers, including the chief of staff. And so they're very quiet. So you see these little feelers being put out. And then the fact that he's mobilized 700 Marines from Camp Pendleton in California, and it is not limited to where they may appear anywhere in the United States. There's no talk about that. So we're beginning to see these feelers go out, and they're very ominous because no, a fascist dictator cannot stay in one place. One of the definitions and identifications of fascism is that it always has to continue to act and escalate and accelerate.
My guess is that there's a fair amount of money in the big, beautiful bill, which is going to expand our budget by $3 to $4 trillion. That money will go to the military. It'll go to expand the military, to give them newer, better weapons and technology. And that's a kind of stroke, isn't it? I mean, on two levels. One is it makes the military more powerful. They already get almost $1 trillion a year, thanks to him. But then also they'll get more money now, a lot more money over the next few years if this bill passes. And if the bill passes, they will be happy. They'll have more money to spend. And he, of course, it'll stick to his fingers, will be happy. But the bottom line is that his bond with the military will increase by the additional money in the big, beautiful bill, right?
Wherever Trump puts his money down, you can bet that there's an alliance going on of some sort, or an alliance he desires, or a source that he wants to use. Um, so, yes, I think that is indicative of the fact that he, of course, understands that to wield power, you need force. And of course, the military is the national force, in addition to which he has this whole theory and of masculinity, of hypermasculinity. So that is all played out in military terms, in terms of force and wrestling and military, police. and violence. There's an undertone of violence
Mm.
makes
It's
Samuel's case.
it's so ironic that he himself avoided military service by a fraudulent bone spur. Anyway, let me go to Tim. Tim, we have Viktor Orban as an autocrat. Trump loves him. Trump follows him. Trump reads his book, and of course, we have Putin, and Trump admires him. I mean, that's so obvious. It's been obvious for a long time. How much of what he's doing in L.A. with the National Guard, with the Marines, and what he's likely to do going forward comes from autocrats in Europe like Viktor Orban and Putin?
The first thing is you try to influence the media before there's any event in the street. That the media is already preconditioned, if you will, to report that which is more beneficial to the administration that's in power. And I see that take place on the early days of Trump's second term, trying to knuckle under CBS, trying to knuckle under ABC, the Washington Post, have them fall in line so that they don't report anything that's not non-complimentary to our dear leader, Donald Trump. So that started immediately in the first few days of the second administration, or even before, where op-eds were not going to take place for the Washington Post and the LA Times. A classic symptom of trying to get media to knuckle under. Certainly another one is that you saw in Russia and the Soviet bloc was dissension was stamped out immediately. Very harsh tactics in the street. You saw those that were simply protesting arrested. Look at Putin after the invasion of Ukraine. By mentioning the word war was sufficient grounds for arrest. And who knows how long you'd be arrested for and where you would end up. These are classic signs, is an overreaction to on-the-street protests. And then, of course, you have what every dictator does is the big lie, is to paint any dissension as not being loyal to the state, that they're a fringe group, they're lunatics. That's what Donald Trump loves to say. They're all lunatics, and they're trying to burn the town down. And he's recently have said that. And then 24 hours later, he's saying, "Oh, things are getting better. They're calm. Oh, and by the way, I'm sending in the Marines because things are out of control." So you have this psychopathy that's taking place with Donald Trump, and it's no different than it was for Mussolini. No different was for Vladimir Putin. You can even look at Nicolae Ceausescu. I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but of Romania. Very harsh crackdowns of any dissension in the streets of Romania. So there's common threads, and all you have to do is look for them.
While we're on the subject, of course, is Xi Jinping, but he's a different kettle of fish, Xi Jinping. And I wonder if he falls in the same category as somebody that Trump would admire. Trump would follow his playbook about maintaining autocratic rule. Or is Trump unable to really understand Xi Jinping and how Xi Jinping develops his strategies?
Well, he likes him if he can control him. Kim Jong Un, he likes him. They wrote love letters back and forth. If you recall those first term overtures that he would play out for the North Korean leader. So he likes him if they don't disagree with him. And that's the classic malignant narcissist that we have as commander in chief.
Ben, it's not only an expansion of Trump's power, it's Trump's ability, willingness, talent at distracting us, using the media to distract us. And that is something that happens or did happen and still happens in Europe. It happens globally. But I think it's really important for us to understand what he is distracting us from. What is so troublesome for him that he feels he needs to do this brown shirt routine in Los Angeles? Your thoughts about what he is distracting us from?
First of all, he is likely trying to distract us from the enormous corruption going on right now in terms of the really I don't know if it's called expropriation or what is it. It's the complete controlling and profiting from the state, to whatever parts of the state are there, to have immense control over it, and to do self-dealing, giving contracts out to friends, giving positions of power to friends who are loyal, and then that's the basic problem of loyalty, right? Is that loyalty is the coin of the realm for him. So I think that there's a likely an enormous amount of corruption going on. I understood at some point he was interviewed, and he had a regret that he hadn't made more money in his first term. He hadn't gone after making more money in his first term than he had done, because he'd been dissuaded by sort of the ethics types. So that's the first thing I think is going on, and it's non-negligible. The second is, there's this kind of uh, coup that uh, the tech bros are trying to do, to essentially eviscerate our democracy, um, and uh, and I think that that is the heart of what's going on. One of the things about the big beautiful bill that people have started to notice is that it has a provision in there that says that no state can pass legislation to address artificial intelligence for the next 10 years. So it's leaving it to be a federal question so that the tech bros can do everything that they're going to do. The whole process of sucking out all of the information, all of our data in across the administration, to get rid of all of the silos and the pressure to then take all that and give it to people like Palantir and others to create massive databases for surveillance of us as Americans, is another piece of this that I think is being somewhat hidden, although people are starting to talk about it, but no one really understands. It's kind of a dark mess at this point. But we do have I recently read where they were saying that even though Musk is gone, Doge is being institutionalized. And controlling our data is the means by which to control, surveil us, and do the classic things of indicting people, trying to intimidate them, etc. I do believe also that the crackdown on the undocumented persons in this country is much less about the issue of immigration and more about creating a state of fear across the country in every neighborhood, so that people hesitate to dissent. Um, I know many occasions have happened where there are opportunities for people to say things, and they have hesitated to say anything that could be vague, critical. We just saw, in with regard to the press, was this guy Terry Moran at ABC made a tweet that he deleted, and he got fired by ABC because of that tweet. That he said something that was negative about Stephen Miller, and so almost within 24 hours the guy is gone. So if you look at all these things, you say, well, there's corruption, there's control of data, there's um, the state is supposed to have the monopoly on violence, and then exercising that monopoly on violence in different ways. There's physical violence is one thing, but also the violence of indicting people, like the congresswoman that's happening. That's a kind of violence. That that's what's going on, and it's moving so many different ways so fast that sometimes I think people find it really bewildering, what to do. And some people actually, I think, like this. They like it this way because they like the strong person vision of leadership. Um, it- it- and unfortunately, I think there's a significant number people in America who, much like a lot of Germans did in the 30s, thought that Hitler, I think this is great what's going on.
You've touched on something that Gene Rosenfeld has written about and studied for decades, and it's the essential Schadenfreude in the species. And what was happening in Germany appealed to Schadenfreude. It's a German word, and what's happening here appeals to the base, and it appeals to people who revel in the notion of punishing those less fortunate. Can you talk about the comparison, Gene?
I have found lately in my study of authoritarianism that it behooves me to look into different fields of study, including social psychology and psychology itself, because we have the strongman here. And the leader in a fascist, and I'm using fascism as a form of authoritarianism, but it is a legitimate subject. There's a lot written about it. And basically, the leader is where all power flows to the leader. And the leader presents himself, usually a male, as the embodiment of the people, so that his desires are identified with the people's desires. And then he makes sure that the people desire what he desires. And then the forceful part of his personality is to achieve whatever his whims are. But this identification with the leader gives his followers, who are often people with grievances, who feel left behind, as we have seen a lot about that in the United States lately about MAGA and the people who affiliate with Trump, is that they see a powerful individual. They see a father, a male, a champion, a messiah. They see somebody who's decisive and cuts through all the red tape. And that identification with that individual actually swells their personality. When he escapes being impeached, or he wins a candidacy among 9 viable candidates for presidency, they identify with that and they feel empowered. He makes them feel empowered. It's a two-way street. They give up their autonomy and their power to him. And in return, he gives them the sense that they are more powerful and more important and that they are seen. So there is that interesting psychology going on. And you see this very much whenever you watch any film of the Hitler rallies. And you go back and you look at the MAGA rallies, and of course, they're on a much smaller scale. Nevertheless, you see the same enthusiasm, you see the same worship almost, and devotion, and this going back and forth. It's an emotional thing. Fascism is not a normal political philosophy, it is not basically intellectual. Mussolini did not know until 10 years after he was in power exactly what he stood for, because he waffled, just like Trump waffles. But what it's about is emotion and power, decision, and so forth. And I want to return to one thing that Ben said when he talked about this assimilating a database through Doge's efforts, all silos going into one database. Think of that as a metaphor for all power in the states going to the national government. And also think about Xi Jinping, who really has done this in Xinjiang, the westernmost province of China, which is largely a different ethnic group and identity of Muslims there in that area. They're not Chinese. And he has databases on every single person. I would say Xi Jinping is further along the authoritarian spectrum than any other leader today, because he is closer to what Hannah Arendt identifies as a totalitarian.
Tim, one of the things that come out of this is something that Anne Applebaum wrote about in the Atlantic a couple of years ago, and it was about how Putin and his friends were able to take control of East Germany and Eastern Europe through fear. And we see Putin doing the same thing with these policemen that are unidentified, that catch you in the street and detain you to parts unknown. We see the assassinations, which are not only intended to assassinate, but to strike fear in the heart of other Russians. Just, Navalny's assassination was not limited to Navalny. And the same with that Russian pilot who escaped to Spain, if you remember. He was assassinated later on. And so my question is, where does fear fit here? Fear is kind of like the Schadenfreude thing. It's a phenomenon, and it's a phenomenon that autocrats use, and they have been using it in Eastern Europe for a long time. And arguably, Trump is using it here. The shock and awe really leads to fear by the ordinary citizen. Your thoughts about that, the comparison?
Well, not to the same intensity of Putin, but Donald Trump, before he was elected for a second term, was going on, and he got plenty of media attention about retribution against his enemies. And people say, well, presidents don't do that. Well, then Donald Trump didn't shrink from that at all. In fact, he went further to prove a point that, I like retribution, and therefore my followers will like retribution. We like retribution, and that is Schadenfreude. See, people experiencing a miserable time. And then since in office, has he not empowered the Department of Justice to investigate some of his political enemies, including President Biden? Has he not taken, the IRS out to the pasture to see what they can dig up on somebody? Has he not taken, the pleasure in front of media to call out certain figures of political enemies and or of the media, the arts or the media, and call them out as either being un-American or woke or not acting in the best interest of the people, the enemy of the people. He likes to say that about the media a lot. So these are all, to a lesser degree, intimidation tactics. Certainly not on the likes of throwing people out the windows in Russia or other places of Europe where political enemies just suddenly are tossed out. But look at Putin did to Navalny. I mean, that was in front of all the cameras in the world. The eyes of the world were watching, and he gleefully took Navalny out, threw him in prison, and to the point where he died. And he didn't bat an eyelash about it. He didn't care. It was an intimidation tactic, and it works wonderfully for Vladimir Putin. And Trump, I'm not saying Trump's going to do the same thing, but he knows the value of media working in cooperation with acts of intimidation.
Ben, aside from the distraction effect that you talked about, there are a lot of things that Trump really doesn't want us to know about. I mean, on the one hand, he plays the media. He's always played the media. And on the other hand, there's certain things that he would like to keep out of the media. Okay? His fight with Musk, very embarrassing. I mean, you can say they're playing a game, this is just another expression of a reality show. But in fact, it's mean versus mean. And, I don't think it helps Trump. And so you wonder about whether this is something that Trump wants out of the media. Also, the possibility that Musk will not give him any more money for primarying candidates and the like for the next election or for 2028. He doesn't necessarily want that in the media. There are cracks in the beautiful bill where some of the senators are saying, "Gee, I got some problems with this. Don't know where that's going to go." Maybe he can force them to vote for it, but he doesn't want the cracks in the media. And if you've watched, the C-SPAN and YouTube, you know that there are Democratic Congress people who are really letting his cabinet have it. The cross-examination is blistering, and that's going out on the airwaves all over the country, the world. You have to assume if it goes out in the country, it goes out into the world. And he doesn't look so good. His cabinet doesn't look so good. The tariffs have failed. Arguably, there's not one single deal that he's made. And, I don't know where the 90 days ends, but it looks like a huge, resounding failure. He doesn't want that to be discussed. The economy, inflation, the price of eggs, the possibility that the fact that they're losing their jobs, small companies are folding, all that. He doesn't want that in the media. And as you mentioned in detail, the corruption, because it's out there, and he's got the plane, but he's also making money on everything. The cruelty you mentioned, and people really don't like that. He doesn't necessarily, maybe he uses that for fear, but it isn't necessarily helping him. His failure, complete failure to do anything about Ukraine or Israel, inexplicable failure. And the wars still go on. And he's powerless, clearly powerless, admitting that he's powerless. He said he was going to cut a deal with Iran. Where's the deal? There's no deal, not even close. Iran is not cooperating in any way with him. And the emergence of other, I'd like to see more of this, but other Democratic leaders like Gavin Newsom taking advantage of the vacuum and the Trump failures, of which there are many. So I wonder if you could comment on how Trump looks in the eyes of the American public, to the extent they think about these things, and probably more appropriate to our discussion today, the people in Europe and Asia, because they follow it just as closely, and maybe they do better analysis on what it means. Maybe they are less likely to be distracted. How are they feeling about Trump's, secret failures?
I would say, speaking on the domestic side first, then I'll go to the international. So on the domestic side, it's the split between the people that Gene talked about who feel empowered by him, and he, if you remember, he said, "I am your retribution." So everyone who has had something go wrong in their life, it's like it's all sucked into him, and by these different actions, maybe he satisfies something in that person. So there's that part of it in this population. And then there's a second part, I would think, in the United States, of people who are absolutely horrified by the fact that he's back in power. And then in that second group, there's the question of who's going to do something about it, or who's going to try to lie low. Um, for example, I just saw recently the executive director of the Skadden Foundation, which is a foundation associated with Skadden Arps, which has done a lot of pro bono work, resigned because there was a lot of pressure on who they could take as clients and their pro bono efforts, which was, a really important part of one reason people went to Skadden was the remarkable pro bono work they did. Well, there are people who are resigning. There's, I believe, the U.S. The prosecutor resigned on the day that the prosecution complaint was filed against that congressman from the congressperson from Newark, Congressman McIver. There was, at the same time it was being announced that they were going to indict her, there was a prosecutor in that office who resigned because he couldn't go along with it. So you do have those kinds of rebellious acts, but there are a lot of people, and this going back to that question of fear, a lot of people who are uh, either fearful to say anything it, because they're going to potentially lose their position, whatever their if Trump turns his focus on them, they can lose their job, and people are fearful of losing their jobs. And a second part of that is, as long as he's shooting at somebody who's not me, I'm okay. And that's it's like the old story about when your neighbor loses their job, it's a recession. When you lose your job, it's a depression. It's that kind of thing. Well, too bad for that person over there. So there are people, I think, who are upset, very upset inside the United States. We're seeing them in the streets, but at the same time, there's a significant number of people who are are hesitant. And it may be also this old issue of a failure of imagination. Um, there's a comment I made before is that when I look at the domestic U.S. press, they were, for example, refracting Governor Newsom's speech the other night in terms of the 2028 elections. They weren't looking at it as a call for us today. They looked at it, it's like he's setting up his own run down the road. And I said, wow, it's amazing how they would go into that classic sort of tunnel when people like Gene and all of you see there's extremely serious stuff going on, and that Newsom is really sounding the alarm, you know. So that's on the domestic side. On the international side, I don't think anybody really fears Trump. I think they just have to deal with him, and uh, to the extent that they need something from the United States, okay, maybe they will work with them. But I think on the international side, it's just that all these different countries, and there's a whole vast number of them, are essentially looking out for their own interests and trying to do a workaround on the insanity that is America. That's right now. And how that workaround happens over the next period, I'm not sure how those workarounds happen. I'm not sure. But it seems to me, my impression is that everyone in the world is recognizing how weak a leader he is in terms of projecting American power. And but they have to, of course, play a little game of trying to look like he's a strong man. But they see that the United States is not doing anything about uh, Gaza and Israel, essentially abandoning Ukraine. I mean, when the Ukrainians did that amazing attack, who did he call? Putin, not Zelensky. You know what I mean? Um, the various these trade deals are not trade deals. They're smoke and mirrors. This one that they're announcing as being this great Chinese one today is basically saying we agree to do what we said we were going to do a month ago. That's it. I mean, it's not like there's any real big breakthrough that's there, but it's touted as some amazing thing. And so I think people look at him as being the leaders around the world see him as a problematic, performative leader who happens to have nuclear weapons, and though they have to deal with him, but they're going to find ways to work around him. Um, there's one other thing, if I could just add, that I wanted to go back to the 1933 Hitler thing, that actually I think is also really important to highlight, is that when Hitler came to power, he immediately had a census done of all of Germany. That's the data gathering process. And he took uh, the advantage of the new thing at that time, which was card punch technology of IBM. They had the card, so they didn't even have standardized cards at the time. What would happen is IBM would meet with the Nazi leaders and say, we need a card that does this, or something. So they say, oh, you need a 50 by 30 or a 20 by 50, whatever. And so then what happened is that everybody's data for everybody in Germany was gathered in the census and then coded into those punch cards. And then you can do sorting. That was the other big new thing at the time was the sorting machine. You could sort. You could pick any criteria and then run the cards through, and a bunch of cards would come out, and that would be the people who meet those criteria. And I know about all this. Why? Because there's a guy named Edwin Black who wrote a book called IBM and the Holocaust, where he detailed how his question was, how did the Nazis get the lists? And this is how, with the use of that new technology. I think that's important because when we look at ourselves today, and we talk about the gathering up of all this data that's going on right now, it is the same new thing vision of these Palantirs and all these other companies using the AI, which is the new thing now, and all that. You see, to essentially create the surveillance state so they can create the list. In fact, they even talk about it for finding the undocumented. They're going through the data to try to figure out who is likely the undocumented ones. So um, I think that that is a hugely significant thing going on right now that I think not only here domestically, but around the world, people are not really grappling with, except I understand in Germany. I hear that in Germany, having had the experience of the Stasi, having had the experience of the Gestapo, and East Germany having the experience, KGB and all that, they're very conscious. And so apparently their law is pretty strong. But we have nothing here in the United States. I mean, if you remember Cambridge Analytica back in 2018, 7 years later, we've done nothing about protecting ourselves. And these people in these companies for profit are getting big contracts under the Trump administration to essentially suck all that data together. And then let's say you have a problem with Social Security, as I'm a retired person. You won't speak to a person anymore. You'll go through an AI system and they can keep running you around and you get nothing. And you can't reach a person to solve your problem. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that that technology can be used to essentially take benefits away from people or give benefits to other people. It's horrific, I think, and that's a parallel that I think gets under examined between what Hitler did when it came to power and now. The one thing I would say is that as Hitler went across Europe, there were some technical people who were willing to sort of help the Nazis. They saw it as an interesting intellectual issue. How can we get the whole population of the Netherlands? How can we do statistical stuff? And but there were other places like in France where it turned out that the head of the statistical office was part of the resistance. So he did all kinds of things to sabotage the process of getting the data. You see? And so it's that kind of thing. It's the whistleblowers that coming out of these different entities like Google and Facebook and all that that are sending us warnings about what is happening to this data that is really the power that Trump will have over all of us. It's
Mm.
very scary.
Yeah, it is scary because if you have those punch cards and you wanted to find every Jew in the community, it wouldn't be hard. And
Exactly.
I would say if you want to find a scapegoat, if you want to scapegoat some group in this country now, no question about it. Trump has the information to do a sort on
Right.
any group he wants to scapegoat. So that's got to be in his playbook.
Yeah, if I could go along, all these words that we learned about in the Holocaust, like selection. Remember the word, the selection, or the thing about people having a number on their arm, right? All that stuff. It turns out the number was their card punch technology number, their card number. That's why they didn't have to, you know, go down lists with them. They had a bunch of cards that would be taken off the train to an IBM machine, and that would tell who was in there. And one of the things that you're speaking to exactly is this idea. Remember the word selection. The card sorting machine did the selection. So it's like this almost kind of computer language that we learn later only now was actually the language, what the meaning of those language terms that we've learned years ago about people being selected by the Nazis and all that stuff. It's heavy to me, you know. By the way, at the end of World War II, uh, IBM started doing its advertising about, guess what? A final solution. I swear to God. I mean, I could not
Oh
believe it.
God! Oh my God!
And Losung, that was the word. I think that's final solution in German. And Losung was their new advertising campaign. You know what I mean? I was like, This book is amazing. You got to read it. It's just something.
Let's go around for final comments because we're out of time. Tim, can you tell us, from all this discussion, where we are on the continuum? We know it's dynamic. We know it will change. We know what's happening in LA is just one blip along the route to more power and dictatorship in the U.S. But where are we on that continuum? And can you give us your final thoughts?
Sure. Well, the continuum has been discussed for the last 9 years since Donald Trump first took first term presidency. And what is that continuum? Well, as this show is discussing, is similarities between what we see today to the 1930s in Germany. Um, you have pundits, you have editorialists that say, oh, no, 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 no. See, you've lost the argument, you've lost your audience. The second you make a comparison to what Donald Trump does or this administration to what Hitler or Mussolini did, back in the 30s and the 40s, you've lost your audience. Well, you know, maybe the fact that you have a conservative administration doing things that are very, very similar to a brutal regime. Maybe it's fair to do that kind of comparison. I'm always thinking of that one saying is just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that there's not someone coming after you. And in this case, we have Donald Trump using a lot of similarity tactics to that of Putin and Hitler and Mussolini, a lot of similar tactics. So is it not fair? Is it not the job of history to instruct or remind us of what took place in the past? That's, again, as Mark Twain said, history does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. I see a lot of rhyming going on here. And Gene, you've done an excellent job here today to remind us of what those rhymes are. And so the continuum is to be vigilant and know your history and look for similarities and call it out.
Gene, it seems to me that the one remaining bulwark of democracy is the media. And there are a number of reporters and media platforms that regularly attack Trump and reveal to us what he is doing. On the other hand, he is at war with them, and he picks them off like he picked off that guy from ABC that Ben talked about before. And he's picking off CBS as well. There was no 60 Minutes this past Sunday, and 60 Minutes is in jeopardy now because of Trump's power over the Paramount merger. So I'd appreciate if you give us your final thoughts, but also talk about the relevance, the importance of that one bulwark that we see, that is the independent media.
Yes. Well, there are a number of journalists who are digging in and doing their jobs, and we're grateful for them. But they are on less stable foundation than they've ever been, because the journalist is the employee and the owner is the one who makes the big decisions, sets the guidelines for the journalist. So when you have somebody like Terry Moran, who goes on X or TikTok or whatever, Instagram, I think. And
it was X. It was X.
And he makes a statement, used to be Twitter, and now it's X because of Musk. When he makes a statement about a member of the administration, Pete Hegseth, as being a hater. Well, that's not an epithet. That's not a terrible word in today's dialogue, but it's too much for his TV company, and so he gets fired. And we see others who are moving to different platforms. Fortunately, the internet works both ways. It's a help and a hindrance. There are still open platforms, but you do see that there is a full court press against journalism per se. Ironically, it was a journalist who gave us the first really great picture of Hitler's regime, and that was William Shirer, who wrote The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. He was there. There may be journalists today who are taking notes, and a lot of them are producing books in real time about what they see and know that they can't put on the pages of their particular newspaper or show. And they are taking their own notes. He kept a diary called the Berlin Diary, which he first published. And then he wrote this monumental work on Hitler's 12 years in power, the Third Reich. And so we have people who are doing that. And there's always a voice that's going to be heard, because even in Stalinist Russia, you had the samizdat, which was the underground press. And so those voices will not be stilled, but who will hear them? The audience will shrink. The audience will be distracted, because in place of the real press, you'll have new organs of power, which are already being put in place and preferred right now. I mean, for the first time in my lifetime, the White House has said to major news corporations, no, you can't come to the presidential briefings. That's never happened before. So this administration is curating everything to amass control, and it's doing it in disturbing ways. I see parallels, and we call them paradigms. It doesn't mean that just because Hitler decided that the Jews were a separate class and were going to be treated separately, that you look in America with a fascist or proto-fascist regime was going to suddenly start looking at Jews. No, what they're looking at is immigrants, and they've been looking at them for a long time. They're setting them aside, and they're treating them differently, and they're oppressing them, and they're incarcerating them, and they're removing them from normal prisons to remote prisons. And then they're putting people in charge of those prisons that are private contractors, not professionals. So we already have an incipient gulag in this country, but it's not Jews that are being trucked there or sent there on the railroads or the buses or whatever. They're immigrants. They're people in various stages of documentation, many of whom are here legally, but they're being oppressed. And we're in the middle of it right now. We better open our eyes. And our journalists that we depend on are becoming fewer and fewer. Their audiences are getting smaller and smaller, and their programs are starting to disappear. Take note of that.
And take note of the fact also that there is no independent press in Russia. It's all state TV. And furthermore, that to the extent there is independent press, it's outside the country. I'm thinking of Medusa and The Beat. These are Russian journalists who cannot exist in Russia and who left Russia so they can write about Russia from outside for the world. And I suggest that that may come to pass here too. If you want to have freedom of speech, you may not be able to stay in this country. Ben, you have the anchor. What are your final thoughts here? And could you talk a little bit about the G7?
One of the things that's happening after Trump's birthday party on Saturday is the G7 is meeting up in Canada from the Sunday, June 15th through the 17th, where they will have all 7 leaders. And one of the things that I think about is whether, and those meetings, and I think Zelensky and some others will be around for bilateral meetings, but whether at those meetings there might even be so far as to have a discussion about the modalities of suspending the participation of one of the states. Something that maybe even the G6 without the United States might have already discussed and want to bring it up on the agenda. There's all issues of, is something on the agenda, is something spontaneous? There are all these degrees, but it essentially signals. I think we should watch what happens during this G7 meeting. But more broadly, everyone I've read who's talked about these kinds of situations have said that you must protest and strenuously do so early on. And things are moving at very fast paces for people. Many people think already it's too late. But I'm not convinced that it is too late. It's only too late if you think it's too late. That's a part of the rationalization that people do to do nothing. I think that the people who are in the streets, the people who are going to be at the various, I think there were 45 demonstrations across the United States in support of the people demonstrating in Los Angeles, just spontaneous ones in big cities. I understand there's something like 1,800 of these demonstrations in small towns to big towns that are going to happen on the 14th of June. And I know there's one in Bethesda, which is literally right next door to Washington, D.C. And there are so many people who are trying to find a way or finding the courage to go ahead and do something. And I'm not saying that they they will win. What I do say is I notice things that make me encouraged. I saw, for example, retired generals commenting on the violation of having Marines and uh, federalized National Guards helping the local police and being a violation, clearly calling it a violation of posse comitatus. That is the way that you hear dissent in the military. It's usually through retired generals and colonels. And so the fact that there are people who are willing to do those kinds of things, I think, are maybe rays of hope. I'm not so sure in 1933 Germany, they were the pitched battles, I think, weren't there between the communists and the brown shirts. But the thing about the brown shirts was that those brown shirts were the surplus uniforms of the German Africa Corps. So they were already making a pitch, sort of to some, noble state entity, even though it was just surplus stuff. We see now with ICE, what are they wearing? Stuff that looks sort of military, right? They're calling us to that. At the same time, that these are subtle things that are done to make us think there's something. And maybe Gene, you got something else you wanted to add there. I saw your finger up there, but I said these are subtle things that are done to, you know, put that halo of our support for the military onto these ICE people. You know, I even see that the idea of them wearing masks. Okay, they're defending that. Says, well, these people will be doxxed and their families will be, and all this kind of stuff. And horrible. And I'm like, well, yeah, but aren't they the state? I mean, they're acting as the state, right? So, it, I don't know. Maybe it's consciousness awareness. I think Governor Newsom and Mayor Bass are doing a great service to this country by what they are trying to instill in us as an understanding. And unfortunately, there don't seem to be enough people in our various governmental entities yet to listen to what the people are saying.
More people would be on the streets, would understand these phenomena if they watched the show today. This was really illuminating today, this discussion. Thank you all for being so wise and well-grounded. So, Gene, you had one comment. You were raising your hand. You wanted to comment on something Ben said?
I was totally agreeing with Ben and happy he raised some of these symbolic issues. I study symbolism because symbolism is one of the ways we can see what's important to the people we don't understand. A symbol always stands for something, and they know what it stands for. It's a code. So I read symbolism like a code. The fact these ICE guys are wearing military fatigues that are worn only in combat, by the way. There are different types of fatigues. We have military officers in my condo, here in Hawaii. And the fatigues they wear every day to go to the office are different from the ones they wear in combat. These guys are wearing combat fatigues, and
Yeah.
they're using flashbangs.
Mhm,
Flashbangs by the military in urban warfare, and
mhm.
they're using faux bullets, but they still sting, of course. But they have all these accoutrements that symbolize. They
Yes.
and he's called it an invasion, and he's talking about you know um, mobilizing the military. And of course, we haven't talked about Texas.
But we don't have time to talk about anything else because we're completely out of time. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much to our co-host, Tim Apicella, and our special guests, Ben Davis and Gene Rosenfeld. I'm Jay Fidell, host of Keeping the World Company, and we've been engaging on It Sure Looks Like the Brown Shirts Have Come to Town. There's so much more to discuss. Thanks to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again soon for the next one. Aloha. Aloha to you all.